Recording. So already today we're going to talk about cost of delay. This is part of a series of GrantTree fundamentals presentations thinking about working on workflow, and just to recap of the general aims of this, we're trying to look at workflow because we think by improving our workflow we improve our efficiency. We also increase our ability to self-manage by taking more control of the business and how it works and how it runs. And by engaging more in thinking about at the level of the workflow, we engage more in systems thinking, which is a more teal perspective and helps us engage with the world in a more powerful way. This series of presentations is about providing some tools and vocabulary for doing this work. It is stuff that's very much already happening. This is just about making it more systematic and driving everyone's involvement and awareness. So last week we talked about how traffic jams form from smooth flows becoming turbulent, and similarly how work stacks up in a system as a result of the interplay of variance and dependency and variability. Yeah, the interaction, dependency and variability. Oh yeah, so the thing about bottlenecks is that work in progress tends to stack up in front of them, and there are some counterintuitive truths about how we manage bottlenecks most effectively. So the classic one is that you think if we can't, as a team, service the volume of work that we have to look after, our natural assumption is that the best way to deal with that would be to increase our capacity as a team by hiring another person. But that actually might make the bottleneck worse, because you might be increasing the amount of work that you're trying to put through the bottleneck without actually expanding the capacity. So sometimes you have to think a little bit counterintuitively when you start operating at the level of the system. This week the subject is queues, right? So queues are obviously relatively linked into bottlenecks. The bottlenecks are the things that cause queues to happen, and there are some counterintuitive truths that are linked to queues and how we manage them effectively as well. So I want to start with a little metaphor, which is there's an approach to front crawl swimming called total immersion. And one of the ways that total immersion is built, one of the assumptions that it's built on, is that in order to get faster when you're swimming, you don't work on optimizing the stroke, you work on optimizing the recovery. Right? So the stroke, the point at which you're pushing yourself through the water, you're already applying power to drive yourself forward. So it's pretty likely that you are going to move forward at that point. Now maybe you could do a little bit of work to apply that power more evenly, or to move more of your core muscles driving through your arm. Sure, there's some work that you can do there. But the biggest optimization you can do is in this bit in between. And actually in total immersion, if you're interested, one of the things that you do is you tip to your side, because that actually makes you much more hydrodynamic, presenting a narrow front to the water as you pass through it. And you keep an arm out, which makes you longer, because longer bodies in water flow more smoothly. But the point is that it's here, when you're not working, that you're able to achieve the greatest improvement in your ability to swim a length quickly. And working harder, i.e. increasing the time when you're pushing yourself forward through the stroke, is not actually the best place to focus innovation. The same is true in the world of work. There's a rule of thumb in workflow design or in kind of manufacturing, which is work generally spends 80% of its time waiting. So any individual piece of work has spent at least 80% of its time in a queue somewhere in a system. Now we talked about this last time, and we kind of know how this applies at GrantTree. This is when Steve came in, and he and Daisy and I were looking at the workflow. If we think about it, the amount of time that we actually spend working on a tax credits claim, actually spend in contact with it, is probably about a day, right? About 8 hours of work on a claim. Now then the minimum time that you might say that we can turn that work around then is 4 weeks and 1 day, right? With the 4 weeks of wait for HMRC, which we have to do. But actually, it's ending up that the piece of work is going to take us at least 8 weeks, or maybe longer, maybe 6 months. So we know that we have weight in here, and that most of the lifetime of any piece of work in progress is spent waiting. So this brings us back to the idea of the swimming and saying, well, can we do something? And again, thinking about the fact of bottlenecks and optimizing bottlenecks, to address that and to do something about that waiting. So there are kind of two truths around queues and how they affect workflows. And the first is that most organizations are blind to queues. And this comes back to the stuff we were talking about around fundamental attribution bias. The queue is generally invisible. The work is visible, and perhaps the workflow is visible, but particularly when it comes to something like knowledge work, the queue is not necessarily obvious. And the costs involved in queuing are generally not quantified. So it's important to think about this. The value of work in progress is leaking away over time, or it can be. There are some examples that I can take us through that explain how that happens. And one approach to dealing with this, and in particular to quantifying the costs as a way of visualizing the queues, is a thing called cost of delay. So cost of a delay is a measure that looks at two axes, right? Importance and urgency. For any of you who've ever read The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, the quadrants of prioritization where he talks about important and urgent, these are two really quite important dimensions that we human beings struggle to separate and think about separately. And because we struggle to think about them separately, we struggle to make sure that we take into account both of these domains at the same time. So this is about saying, you know, looking at the both value and speed of work. What will cost us the most by delaying its delivery? We're thinking, you know, what is the impact of not completing a piece of work? So in software, people often say, you know, for every week features aren't making us money, for every week there's a piece of work in progress that isn't making us money, it's costing us money. Right? Because if we've started on it, there's some value that we can realize, we're not realizing that value. We have to recognize that where we have multiple pieces of work in progress, where we're waiting to realize their value, selecting which one we're going to do, there's a choices in there, which is which of those pieces of value is it most important to realize, and the ones that we're holding back are ones where we are costing ourselves the realization of that value. I'll take us through an example in a little bit, which will make that a little bit clearer. I do want to touch on the idea of value. Obviously, an important component of value is money, and I think that this is a really useful framework that I came across through one of the people who do some coaching around cost of delay, for breaking down this discussion of value around money and saying, actually, where does it fit in? There are all kinds of monetary value that you can think of in a piece of work. There is, you know, a piece of work that you're doing because it protects your current income streams, and there are pieces of work that grow your income streams, but then there's also thinking about cost. Protecting our current cost base is important too. It means making sure that we're not liable to new costs as they start to rise, and is actually just as valuable in terms of its impact on the bottom line as work to decrease cost. I think the one for me that's most interesting that comes out of these quadrants is the idea of protecting the current cost base against future growth. So that's a little bit of an interesting framework, but slightly a sideline. What I really want to do is to think about the cost of delay and to work through an example, very exciting and interactive with a whiteboard, to try and illustrate how this works. So if we have these three pieces of work, right, and they're various stages away from completion, it doesn't matter to us for the purpose of this example whether these are all pieces of work that take 6 weeks, some of which are some of the way through. What matters is what's the time to completion from now, and what's the value that will be realized at the point at which the work is finished. So there are various ways that we could schedule this work, and each of them will have a cost of delay. And then we can, by looking at the cost of delays of the various ways, we can illustrate some truths about the system. So one way of doing this would just be to say, well, we're going to work on all three pieces of work at once. We're not going to particularly differentiate them. There's a delivery, we'll deliver them all in 13 weeks, which is 3 plus 4 plus 6, right? So in 13 weeks, we'll deliver A, B, and C at once, and then we'll realize the total value available to us, which is 19,000. So in that case, the cost of delay is 13 weeks times 19,000, which is, I wrote this down because I'm not Rachel Riley, I'm not going to pretend to be, is 247,000, right? So that's the cost of delay of working on all three features simultaneously, delivering them all at the end, realizing the value of all of them at the end. An alternative way of scheduling them, we might say, okay, well, maybe the best way of doing it is to work on the shortest one first. Because then we know we're going to, and if we deliver them in the length in which they come, then we know that we're going to be realizing value earliest. We're going to get the first invoice paid quickest by working on the shortest piece of work first. Right? So in that case, the cost of delay is we start by working on piece A for 3 weeks. So over 3 weeks, we have a cost of delay of 19,000 because nothing's being delivered. So that's the value of the work in progress. So we have 3 times 19, which is 57. Then we're going to work on piece B, which is the next shortest piece of work. So for 4 weeks, we're going to have a weekly cost of delay of 16,000. So we're going to have 4 times 16, which is 64. And then finally, we're going to work on C, which is 6 weeks times 9,000, which is, or so this gives us a total cost of delay of 1, 2, that's 157. Oh no, it's not, it's 175. Sorry, 175. Right. So doing it this way round, we've reduced our cost of delay. But this is kind of this first step is quite intuitive, because you just think if we worked on them all at once and deliver them all at the end, we invoice them all at the end, we don't get any cash until the end. Right. That's how it impacts us. Alternatively, we deliver some of them along the way, so we're going to have a better level of cash flow. So we expect that this measure, which is trying to help us optimize the system, is going to show a decreased cost of delay, i.e. it's going to show an improvement. Right, so that's the first option, is saying, okay, let's schedule them in by length of time to completion. The next kind of maybe intuitive option is to say, well, actually it's more important to schedule them by highest value first, so that we get the biggest invoice paid initially. Maybe that's going to be the most important customers, right? Okay, so then we say, okay, well, we'll work on C first for 6 weeks. So that's 6 weeks where we've got a weekly cost of 90, which is 114, right? And then the next highest value is B. So we work on that for 4 weeks. And then we have a weekly cost of 10,000, which is 40. And then finally, we're going to work on A for 3 weeks, cost of 3, which is 9, which gives us a total of 163. So there's a moderate improvement in doing it this way with this particular set of work. Now, the thing about cost of delay is it suggests that actually there's a better way than all 3 of those intuitive measures, and that's to use something called CD3, which is cost of delay divided by duration. So we look at the ratio between the time left to completion and the value that can be realised. Okay, I'm just going to use a slightly scrappy piece of tissue just to wipe that up. Never let it be sent. Cost saving, I brought that from home.
What's the cost of delay?
Well, as opposed to having a whiteboard marker, well, that's probably negligible. So we can look at the ratios, right? So 3 divided by 3, the ratio is 1. 7 divided by 7 divided by 4 is 1.75, and 9 divided by 6 is 1.5. So these are the ratios. So if we schedule them, we schedule them with the, I'm going to double check the example. So we schedule them with the highest CD3 first. So we do B first, and then C, and then A. And then I was thinking, I haven't written down the numbers for this one. Am I just going to do it? Yeah, okay, let's do it. It's only maths.
Well, let's calculate your hair if you want.
It's only maths. Let's not be scared of maths. So we're going to start by doing B, right? So we're going to work for 4 weeks, and we know that that's 4 times 19. And then we're going to do C. So we're going to work for 6 weeks, and it's 6 times 12. And finally, we're going to work for A, which is 3 times 3. So 3 times 3 is 9. 4 times 19 is 76. 6 times 12 is 72. 72 and 76 is 148. And 9 is 157. Is that right? Sounds convincing, doesn't it? But the point is 157. So if you have that balance, right, by doing the most valuable first, the cost of labour is 163. Well, this is 157. Now let's think about why this is the best way of doing it. It's because what we're trying to do here is optimize the ratio between those 2 dimensions of urgency and speed. So we're trying to say, we're going back to that key question, which was, what will cost us the most by delaying its delivery? And what this gives us is, it gives us pieces of work which come in kind of 2 kinds. Right? There are pieces of work that are wide, and there are pieces of work that are tall. So if you think, pieces of work that are wide are pieces of work where the value that's going to be realised is relatively small and the time that it's going to take is relatively long. And pieces of work that are tall are ones where the value is high and the time it's going to take is small. Now, if we think about this in terms of our workflow in tax credits, right, there's an obvious application here. Because we have claims at varying levels of completion. We have claims that require varying levels of time to push them through to the end, to the point where value is realised, and ones of varying value. And this allows us to make, if we start doing some maths around this, it allows us to make some quite sophisticated decisions about saying which is the most important piece of work in the system for us to pick up now. And it's the one that has the best ratio between the time that it's going to take us to get it to completion and the value that's going to be realised at that point in time. So in terms of the value of cost of delay as a measure and why we should be interested in it, it's a really good tool for prioritisation. People think of economics as being the science of money. Economics is a study of scarcity and the choices that people make under conditions of scarcity. Right? The resources that we have are limited. So we are forced into a situation where we have to decide what work are we going to start on, and also when are we going to stop looking at a particular piece of work and pick up something else because it has become more valuable. There are other ways in which this measure can be useful to us, cost of delay in CD3. Right? As I said at the start, it's a system level measurement. So it allows us, so it's about, we saw from the example of these three pieces of work, A, B and C, that it was about optimizing the order that we took the work through the whole system. So it takes us to say, well, if we experiment on workflow, what impact does it have on cost of delay? It gives us a measure by which we can start having conversations about this. We can start making the trade-offs between, working on, because at a system level there are always going to be trade-offs. Do we want to work on this quickly? This would typically more apply, but you could see if you were developing a piece of software or something, you could say, do we want to work on this feature quickly and ship it, and it maybe not be the best that it possibly could be, but it's done? Or do we want to work on it for a little bit longer and have the likelihood of it having to be reworked later in the future reduced? Right, you start to be able to have some numbers to drive the conversations around to drive these kind of conversations around trade-offs. And because cost of delay contains those two axes of speed and value, of importance and urgency, it starts to get us to think in this way. And it's a really powerful habit of thinking to say, oh, hang on, am I considering just value? Am I considering just kind of that importance here? Or am I considering the speed and urgency dimension as well? Yeah, what ultimately matters is not the figures that you attach here, but it's a tool to have this conversation. Thinking about some ways in which cost of delay is interesting around our workflow around tax credits. If you are scheduling a piece of work and you have a hard deadline, let's say, we assume that if we have a deadline that something has to be filed in December, we know there is a date that has to be picked up 6 weeks in advance, let's say, is what we try and schedule. So in terms of modelling cost of delay, you might say, well, in all the weeks running up to the point at which you know you have to pick the work up, there is no cost of delay, right? So you can pick the work up if you have capacity, but it's not urgent to pick it up. And then the cost of delay starts ramping up. We also have this value cliff, which is that we have hard deadlines on our work, which can't be surpassed. If we ship a piece of work late, if we miss a grant deadline, if we miss a filing deadline, then all of the value in that work, all of the potential to realise value in that work disappears in an instant. That's quite a challenging condition under which to be scheduling, but it's interesting to think, how does it impact this maths? How does it impact the way in which we want to schedule stuff? And there's also a broader question about value, right? I said that those 4 quadrants allow us to look at the monetary component of value, but there are other components as well, like relationships. We might say, well, actually, this is not a financially very valuable piece of work for us, but this is somebody who it's really important to work with because this is one of the first series of claims that we're doing with an accounting partner, whatever it is, right? There might be other things that contribute. How do we measure that? How do we begin to factor that into the discussion and start to set those various kinds of value against each other and measure them together? Or maybe there are others, right? Maybe there are purpose questions as well. We might say, well, this is a client who we really feel that we're helping them and it's important for us to help them for reasons of our own value structure. So that is cost of delay and CD3 and queues, which obviously follow on from last week's subject of bottleneck, and will lead next week, I'm sure, to some other exciting topic. In the meantime, any questions?
Yeah, I just had a quick question. Back when we were doing the maths and the example, when we were doing this one exactly. So what was the multiplier again? So I just missed one aspect of that equation and I didn't catch up. So
to try and work out the cost of delay in general.
Yeah.
So if we were doing them in this order, in whether this is time doing the first to complete first. For 3 weeks, we have 3 pieces of work in progress. So we're holding in the system unrealized value totaling the 3 pieces of work. So for 3 weeks, we have 19,000 each week.
Thank you.
Yeah, and then we have 4 weeks with 16,000 and 6 weeks with 9.
Thank you.
Feel free to come up to me at any other point with questions as well, by the way. If you're still trying to digest the maths of this for now, then
So just a quick question. It might be an offline question as well, but just sort of curious on how it might work. So I'm trying to figure out at the moment like cost per claim based on the Guardian and the payroll data. Getting some progress on the modelling stuff, but in terms of understanding the cost delay and how to fit that into the model, like what sort of parameters do you think we could use? I mean, like if we have a claim that's say 3 months long compared to 5 months long, I mean, how can you sort of measure that cost of delay based on the data that we have? Like what do you think might be a starting point?
So there are the two most obvious measures that you need are the ones that are here, which is what is the value that's going to be realised for us in this piece of work, and how long is it going to take for us to get to the realisation of that value. There is another dimension as well to think about, which is sort of more subtle, which relates to some of those questions at the end, which is like actually what is this assumes that like how do we model the fact that there are hard cut-offs on things, and that if we don't begin work on things then we lose the opportunity to realise any value in them, and how do we manage that. And there are also questions about stuff that we might not know that this piece of work. Okay, so let's assume that this is a claim. Let's assume that C is a claim that we haven't done any work on, and our standard assumption is that a claim we're going to allow 6 weeks for it in the system. But we also know that once we've done, let's say, 2 days of work on it, we have a much better sense of how long it's going to take, because we've looked at the data from the client. We know if it's a complex claim or not. We've maybe had some contact with the client and we have a sense of their responsiveness. So it may be that by doing 2 days of work, we're able to gather information that tells us about whether this is actually a claim that we can finish by the end of the week, or one that we're not going to get done until close to the heat death of the universe, right? So there might be, that might affect the way that we choose to schedule it, the fact that we can gather more information into the system.
It seems to me that to the extent what we're measuring there is sort of inventory, effectively, sort of like inventory of work that we have in progress. And there's kind of implicit factor of calling it cost of delay, that we naturally want to reduce the cost of delay, because it seems like a cost and we want to reduce cost. That's one of the ways to improve the bottom line. But at the same time, if our sales are ramping up, it's natural that our inventory is going to ramp up as well. Like even if we do get the process in place to process all the inventory, there is going to be a kind of element of inventory, like number of claims in progress growing as the sales grow, as our capacity to process claims grow. So I mean, I'm not sure where I want to take this question, but just like one angle was, can we effectively measure this cost of delay in the system right now just by measuring the inventory, the number of claims we have in progress, and just each week, let's say we have £500,000 worth of claims in progress, then each week we add 1 week of £500,000 of cost of delay, and then we can measure the cost of delay across the year or something and see whether we're improving it. But then the question is it actually an improvement to reduce it, or does it just mean that the sales are not happening?
So the real value, I think, of this as a measure is about saying, okay, we have a number of pieces of, because the point is that we might have, going back to the fact that queues relate to bottlenecks, right? Queues are things that fall in front of bottlenecks. And you can have, as I said last week, right, two kinds of bottlenecks. You can have internal bottlenecks and external bottlenecks. So essentially, we have that as well, right? We have, oh no, even better. Right, let's assume that this is the tax code's workflow, and there, whatever it is, that's the internal bottleneck. So we assume that there's going to be a queue of work that stacks up in front of this internal bottleneck, but there's also a queue of work here, right, which stacks up as well, which is the work that we're selling and not starting on, which is much more related to the marketplace, this kind of external one. So in some ways, as you say, right, the more work that we put, I mean, there is an interesting question, which is this work here that we've got that we need to start on, the more that we push it into here, it creates issues in a system, in a workflow. The more pieces of work that you start to put in it, the harder it becomes to service that volume of work, because, like we know this ourselves, that if we were working in a one piece in, one piece out person way, then we would need a much less detailed CRM, because one person picks up a piece of work, services it, and then ships it out. That's not possible. So we begin to have to shift between tasks much more, and there are reasons that we have to do that, right? That we are constrained by the kind of work that we do, right? Fair enough. But in terms of measuring cost of delay or bringing stuff into inventory, it is the case that the more pieces of work that you bring into inventory, the greater the burden of servicing that inventory per piece. But for me, where this is interesting for us, is because yes, there is a sense where we could say, the total cost of the delay in system is just going to keep going up because we keep bringing stuff in. But actually it's about saying, okay, given that we are admitting stuff in, what do we want to pick up? What do we want to move forward? Which of the pieces of work that we have agreed to have in progress are most important to us? And it may be, as you say, right, that there are pieces of work at the start of that where we've just sold them, and it's very important that we have contact with the client and we start to build that relationship early and we don't lose that momentum. So, there is perhaps a non-monetary reason for us to do some stuff to get stuff off the starting line. But then we might say, okay, well, once we've done that, once we've got that piece of relationship moving, actually, all the pieces of work are equal in the system in terms of relationship building, and we need to look at other things to say what we're going to move forward. But there's no absolute answer, but it opens out a discussion about what are the most important things for us to work on in the system right now, what should we prioritise.
Is this not more applicable to sort of the sales pipeline, whereby all our leads are basically in a bottleneck, so to speak, and then you realise the financial gain of it. Once it's within the keep net, so to speak, it's more of a sort of rejigging it. We have them, we've not yet, I don't think, missed the deadline.
No.
So there is obviously we can refine it, but does this not apply a much more earlier on, because it's realising the potential money as opposed to once it's in here, it's just a matter of running through the process?
Well, I mean, it definitely applies to both the sales pipeline and the delivery pipeline. Yeah, all of this workflow stuff can be applied across the sales pipeline, absolutely. So I think my answer would be that it applies to both. It applies to both. And it is an interesting question to say, we have all this work in progress, which stuff is it most important for us to pick up? Because we are optimizing it if we're the wide versus tall work ratio, if we're saying, we're actually picking up we're always picking up the most optimum piece of work as a system first. That's going to be very beneficial to our cash flow, to our health as a
We
business.
have on average about half a year, we say, to process the claim, don't we?
Maybe
the time on that one, don't we, as opposed to.
It may be in the course of that year, if we think of the weekly cost of delay of a piece of work, that for 4.5 months, the cost. I mean, we might say, okay, well, initially it's essential that we do. Initially, there is a high cost because we have to have contact with that client early on so that they know that they're within our system and they feel looked after. But actually, the cost of delay per week goes down to effectively zero for 4.5 months. So if stuff comes in from the client, we can move it forward. But actually, we're not under time pressure until we get to here. And then, I don't know. There are interesting questions to open up about that.
Yeah, I had some objection to that idea that the cost of delay is zero when the client is unresponsive, because like ultimately we can use the money, we are using the money for various things. So as long as we have a use for the money, then the cost of delay, even if we're not doing any active work, is not zero. Because if we had the money earlier, we could use it, to pimp out the train hours, to...
But that's high assets and things like that. If you own a house, it's an asset, isn't it? So you liquidate it, you can't do anything with money. But I wouldn't say it costs you...
Well, yeah, but so that's if you don't have anything to do with the money that you're trying to get out of the house, that's fair enough.
Yeah.
But if you're waiting to buy another house that's going to make you more money with that money from the house, and you're waiting an extra 6 months to liquidate the first house, then you're missing out on 6 months of income from the second house.
Yeah.
So there is a cost of delay, even if there's no interaction with it.
So that, I'd say that happens on the first day. I'd say once you get going, you should have a decent enough cash flow whereby the previous business fills that gap, and when that's realised, it fills that gap, and that fills that gap, and that fills that gap.
Take that
Sorry,
yeah,
offline.
sure.
So, Andrew, just one quick thing regarding this. It is the idea to monitor it to a point where we know that if we strike while the iron's hot, get this level of information, we get a much smoother process. So we can start saying, well, okay, we had 10 clients or 20 clients that we did this and this to, and this happened. We had 20 clients that did this and this. Actually, what we realised that the overall cost, if we hit these points, this point, and this point, was sort of 50% less because we found the workflow happen more quickly. Is that sort of thing we're trying to get to?
Yeah, and that's where it sort of starts to feed into the stuff that we did last week about managing bottlenecks and how you do that. This is a way of measuring, how efficiently, effectively work is flowing through the system. So, I take your objection, Ella, but it's a point of theory here, which is that if you are scheduling a piece of work, and that is a 6-week piece of work, but you have a 6-month window in which to do it, then it's a point of theory here, which is up to the point at which you absolutely have to start this work in order to make sure that you hit the deadline. The cost of delay per week is zero. Now, this is on the basis, but this doesn't take into account non-monetary value, right? So there may be stuff, as I've said, where it's like, actually there's a relationship value, or if the client suddenly becomes responsive, things change. Okay, great, that's the way in which it starts to become interesting, because we start to look at how it applies in the real world rather than just in the textbook. But in the textbook, the point is, if you have a 6-week piece of work and 6 months to do it, then the cost of delay is zero until 6 weeks before the end. Because you don't have to work on it. You're not actually jeopardizing your ability to realise value from that work. From the purely monetary point of view, from the relationship point of view, and from the point of view of the particular constraints on our work, which is that waiting for the client is difficult, and the client's responsiveness has a value to us, right? Client's responsiveness, the level of responsiveness they're currently exhibiting, has a financial value to us. Yeah, that begins to then change it from the pure theory, but that's where that came from. Nobody else? No? Okay.
I kind of feel like, sorry, just banging on about that point about the cost of delay again, the zero cost of delay. Just
Why don't we
because
have a chat about that?
Because it's a relevant point to everybody. That's the thing. I want people in the client management team to understand this point, that the delays are not free. So if all our service happened in a day, every single claim was processed within a single day, that would change our cash flows massively. It would have an immediate impact of adding probably £500,000 to our balance sheet, like pretty much right away, because there's all that inventory that suddenly would be realised instead of sitting in limbo. If we were to then sit on that £500,000 and not do anything with it, then yeah, the cost of delaying that £500,000 to be in a year's time is zero. But if we have something to do with that £500,000, then the cost of delay is not zero, because we could put that £500,000 to work in the Power Up Fund. We could put that £500,000 to work in Treehouse version 2. We could put that Power Up Fund.
Do you know the thing that you're missing here, Dan, is the bottleneck. We have a limited capacity. So this is about saying, given that it is the case that we have a bottleneck somewhere within our system, that is, and the definition of a bottleneck, which if you missed this, and if you didn't watch last week's video, maybe you did watch last week's video, I don't know. Oh no, because you can't watch last week's video because it was still on the card.
Yeah.
So, yes, you have a presidential pardon for like the Thanksgiving turkey for not having watched it is Thanksgiving, by the way, today, for anyone who's watching this video in the future and wonders why I'm talking about the presidential pardon for turkey. So the point is that the bottleneck by definition is operating at 100% capacity. and we can't service anymore. So yes, it's true, if we had unlimited capacity, then we should say, well, we want all the money that we can realise straight away, so we want to just work on every piece of work we possibly can do, but we can't. And because we can't, we have to start making a selection. And the selection that we make among the various pieces of work in progress that we have, whether they're sitting just outside the pipeline or whether they've already moved inside it, is about saying which of these pieces of work is the most valuable. And assuming that we have pieces of work that are closer to the cliff that they fall off where they lose all of their value than this one for which we have 6 months, there is a discussion about whether or not we should do anything on this when we have other things in progress. Right? But the balance between them is not entirely on the basis of how long are they going to take and when are they due, but it's about the interaction of that and the value that's available to us, right? That's the point, is the cost of delay is about using these two measures. But questions like this, like, well, surely if we could work on this and then we get, like, yes, exactly, this is exactly the sort of question that we should be asking, not just in this group, but like as part of starting to engage in the workflow. I think that's a really useful question to ask. Is that truly done? Brilliant. Thank you very much. Oh no, was that all? Was that
The time to completion on tax credits is obviously a tough one.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like, because clearly it depends on lots and lots of things. I mean, you could kind of simplify that, but actually try and get it to a time increment in days or whatever. That's really hard. I mean, you could say someone's being either responsive, unresponsive, or kind of normal, but like to actually do this, I'm trying to think how you would, if you were to do it in Guardian perhaps, because we have clearly got the value stuff, but how would you implement the time to completion? Does anyone have any kind of ideas on that? Because clearly, depending on the client's next action, that
you monitor the successes. So you monitor clients that turn quickly or clients that respond quickly and start working out what it is you did. Is it something you can roll out? Is it something you can copy? Or is it just purely coincidence? Or is it because they're just a proactive person?
I think that's not, that's a misunderstanding of you. I meant to take a single client and we say time to completion. Okay, they might have done certain things, so putting a time on that is quite tough.
Well, you can make an estimate. I mean, the Guardian used to do that as well.
Okay.
It had an estimated delivery date, which was wildly inaccurate. So
Yeah,
your point is actually quite fair.
Go on, Justin, you've been working on this. You've been so excited.
I was going to say with the time completion,
Yeah.
we can like model we can get the time that it takes to finish a claim in days, but it won't have the amount of chasing required.
Exactly.
Yeah, that requires a bit more effort to sort of like churn through a whole bunch of data. So for example, we go through every email that we've ever received for that client in that period of time. That might be another parameter to say, okay, that's a pretty unresponsive client, and so on and so forth. But we don't really have it yet. It's kind of possible to get something, but
On
taking your time.
Guardian, does it have number of emails sent, number of phone calls made?
It does actually,
Releases
and the clever way to do what you're suggesting would be to actually have a kind of machine learning algorithm around this that just tries to identify what kind of client this is.
Yeah.
Is this a slow client? Is it a fast client? How far along the process are they? How long does it typically take for this category of clients to finish?
Yeah.
And it would be a better estimate than the thing that I did in Guardian V1 ages ago. And I'm sure Brady would be delighted to build that tomorrow, basically.
I mean, I would strongly suggest that in terms of any work around workflow, that this question of the impact on cost of delay as a measure that is the variability that it takes for us to wait for pieces of work with a client, and the way that waiting stage is the bottleneck, the biggest bottleneck in our work. How can we quantify that? Because what we want to be doing, as I think we were saying last week, is if that's the bottleneck in the system, that's the thing that we want to be optimizing. If we want to optimize it, we need some kind of measure to know whether or not it's better or worse if we do it this way or that way. So it seems to me that as a business, this question of how do we quantify the time left to completion on a piece of work when there's so much variability around waiting for the client is probably one of the most important questions that we have, at the moment.
So, just to clarify, the bottleneck that is in the tax trace process at the moment is the waiting for the client for the data, basically, or some kind of variant waiting. So when you were saying the cost of delay is zero, you were talking about the period before we've contacted the client, for example. So when we haven't contacted the client yet, we haven't made the claim live yet, because we know that we have that bottleneck, and that bottleneck is full up at the moment. We've got everybody's waiting for like 200 clients to get back to us, so we don't want to add another client to that pile because it doesn't help. Was that what you were saying?
Do you know? I don't know if that was what I was saying, but let's pick up this discussion.
I think it's what you were saying.
Okay.
Have that.
Actually, yeah, I'm sure. Probably that's
Such a lovely fundamental there.
Let's pick that up because it's quite a granular detail. I'm sure we can work it out together. All right. Thank you very much, everybody.
Cheers, mate.
Cheers.